Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 5th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be asking ourselves, can Russia hold the front anywhere? The home front, northern front, southern front? It looks like they are falling back in every one of them. Let's get into it. Okay, so first and foremost, of course, we are going to be looking at the Kharkiv front. As you can see here, there's been significant progress in the last 24 hours. Most notably, you can see here, as of the 3rd, Ukrainian forces had not yet linked up their remaining bridgeheads at Dovorichna and Kupiansk and the Borova, but Russian forces had retreated. Now we see the final salient has retreated, and Ukrainian forces have established a contiguous front all the way stretching from Lyman and Yampil up to Dovorichna. This is significant, again, because the Oskil River formed a major geographic barrier that really I expected at least, crossing to be extremely difficult for Ukrainian forces, and yet they were able to cross at 3 major crossing points, plus swing around in the south where there really isn't a significant river obstacle. And by keeping their momentum going, they are able to hit the Russians before they can establish new defensive lines. And we see that Russians are again retreating. Again, they're going to have to dig in. But as with Ukrainian forces continuing to push, continuing to advance, Russian forces are going to find themselves retreating again and again unless they can establish a really meaningful defensive posture. And I don't really see any geographic feature that's going to compellingly let them do that. They can sometimes rely on roads, but roads are just not good geographic boundaries. They're oftentimes built into low-lying areas. That's sort of the natural. It's just less expensive, right, to build a road in a valley than up a mountain. But it means that they are not really good defensive boundaries. There's not really a major river, a major forest. They're going to have their work cut out for them, and they're going to probably have to rely on the old Russian tactic of trading space for time. That's a technique of basically engaging in a fighting retreat, yielding territory to the enemy, and grinding them out in a battle of attrition. That's not necessarily a losing strategy. It worked for them in the Second World War, but there's a key difference. In the Second World War, they were yielding Russian territory, pulling the enemy deeper into their web. None of this is Russian territory. So that strategy may end up backfiring if it's the one they decide to pursue. When we look to the south, you could see the south has had also lightning progress, right? When we zoom in to especially the northeast corner of Kherson, we could see here that there has been a significant breakthrough. As we've been talking about for some time now, Ukrainian forces have effectively created a flank between the western sort of salient here and the northeastern salient along the river. But as we've seen, the Russians learned their lesson in Lyman and retreated much earlier, or possibly have just not received word from their command. Depending on the source you're looking at, there's a lot of sources that indicate that command and control of Russian forces in this area had effectively diminished, and this was less of a retreat and more of a rout. No order given, just simply Russian forces realizing that they are unable to continue fighting, or they can't raise their command, and so just sort of flee in a panic. But regardless of why the encirclement threat delivered on its promises, right? It yielded a lot of territory. And now, as we talked about in the northeast, the Russian forces are going to need to establish new defensive lines. And if they weren't able to hold their previous defensive lines, right, which were very locked in, they had months and months to dig them out, build them up. If they couldn't hold those, it seems unlikely that in the hours that they have to establish new defensive positions, that they're going to be able to dig in and hold Ukrainian forces at bay. That's sort of how we've seen, at least in the northeast, this play out. Once you force the Russians out of their preset positions, they tend to have a much, much, much harder time holding territory. In contrast, right, Ukrainian forces seem to actually get better when they're put on the offensive. And I think this is a key difference between NATO and Cold War legacy doctrines, right? Traditional NATO doctrines. Okay, warrants a little bit of an explanation, but bear with me. NATO in the Cold War promised to defend every inch of NATO territory. And that was a problem because one of those NATO countries was Germany. So that meant that normally a country, right, when someone is being invaded by a numerically superior power, like we talked about, you can trade space for time. You fight, you withdraw, you pop back, you deal more damage to the enemy, you fall back. The problem was Germany said, you can't use our country to trade space for time. We're not going to have our country destroyed by a war for the third time in the 20th century. And so NATO said, fine, we will come up with a new way of war, one that involves when we are attacked, we counterattack harder. This is why they developed, deep strike multi-role aircraft, why they developed this tank doctrine that was about lightning charges. This is why even things like mechanized infantry became tremendously important to NATO forces, why mobile artillery became much more important than static artillery positions. All of these things combined to create something called air-land battle doctrine, where air power would essentially pave the way for land power to push in response to an invasion. It's sort of like a boxer who senses their opponent winding up and taking a big strike, and that boxer counters by throwing a lightning jab right down the center, stopping their opponent in their tracks. This is the core of NATO doctrine, and it proved very effective in the first Gulf War, right, in Iraq, Afghanistan. Admittedly, there was a little bit of a numerical advantage on one side, but the fact that this strategy resulted in, 5, 10, 20 casualties from the attackers, when traditionally in military doctrine, attackers take twice, 2 or 3 times as many casualties. And so you can see, I think this is exactly what NATO doctrine would expect, is that you break the enemy lines and then you press your advantage continuously, never letting the enemy reestablish their command, control, and defensive positions, and you always keep pushing them back. And that's what we've seen, right? The Ukrainian forces, sometimes they're advancing quickly, sometimes they're advancing slowly, but since the Kharkiv offensive, they have been on a continuous policy of advancing. Right. Now, when we look at the Institute for the Study of War, these guys are really good in their analysis of the Russian information space. This is what's going on in the Kremlin and in Russia. And the answer is things are kind of chaotic, right? We talked about the ongoing fighting in Kharkiv and Kherson, but what we don't see is the fact that all of the supporters of this war are starting to turn on each other. This is a classic move. It happened to U.S. Iraq war supporters in the mid-2000s once people realized it wasn't going to be the quick, easy victory the Hawks had hoped for. But what happens is everyone starts to blame each other for their mistakes because nobody wants to be left holding the bag on a failed military adventure. You can see that there are Russian mill bloggers and war correspondents, former Russian officers and veterans, and, of course, what they're calling Russian siloviki, people with their sort of own militaries. These include the Wagner Group and the Chechen forces, who have been operating semi-independently. Of course, each one of these are mad about different things. The veteran community is more closely aligned with the Russian Ministry of Defense. You've got the Siloviki providing their combat power on the battlefield, but Putin needs all 3 of these people to help him out. He needs these sort of pro-Russian nationalists providing this information and intellectual space and propaganda. He needs the Wagner Group and the Chechens and other independent fighting forces because they are some of the best fighting forces right now that Russia can get their hands on, but he also needs the Ministry of Defense and uniformed Russian military veterans on his side to encourage people to support the Ministry of Defense. The problem is, right now, all of these factions are blaming each other for the failures in the Russian military space, right? They're mad that the Kremlin didn't punish Kadyrov or Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner group, for not following Ministry of Defense guidance, but they themselves blame Ministry of Defense for leaving units stranded in Lyman. It's just absolutely chaos. And this, to me, is a sign of an end game. Now, Russia's famous for being able to fight and keep fighting long after a reasonable country, would have considered some form of capitulation. But in places, Russia still loses wars. They lost the first Chechen war in Grozny. They lost the Soviet-Afghan war in Afghanistan. And Putin surely should understand that realities on the ground, you simply sometimes can't avoid. You can't propaganda your way out of military losses. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a Russian military that just can't seem to get it together, and a bureaucracy that cannot get itself organized enough to actually deliver combat effective forces to the battlefield. Okay, so again, we're going to see how this plays out, but it really looks worse and worse for Russia. Now, guys, thank you so much for joining me. If you want to help support the channel, definitely consider becoming a member of the Patreon. As you guys can see, YouTube has just done just a little bit of cracking down on my monetization. Each one of these limited ads basically is functionally no ads, which I understand. YouTube is a platform, they get to censor whatever they want. But that said, I try to put out information for you guys, stuff that is relevant and important for you guys to understand the conflict. And so if you can support me on Patreon, that would be a huge help. We also give you guys the exclusive combat footage, breakdowns that I can't even attempt to put on YouTube. And of course, also, if you can't do that, you can always help out by clicking the link to check out ground.news. They've been a sponsor of this channel for weeks now, and they're a great resource to help you identify media bias and figure out what is truth and what is exaggeration and misinformation. And in this conflict, you can't get that enough. Anyway, guys, thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one.